Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm joined by only the second doctor I've had on here, Ryan Shuvera, to discuss a very interesting term in the domain of Indigenous musicology,
Yeah.
um, hungry listening. It's Dylan Robinson's idea, and it's super interesting. And I'm joined by Ryan to help me explain this because this is his uh, field of expertise. And before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter, which is just my name, David Guignau. If you want to help me out, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. Who knows, they might get a kick out of this. And yeah, don't waste any more of your time with that. Let's begin firstly with Ryan. Anything else you want to add about yourself and a properly contextual land acknowledgement, given the obviously the subject matter and where you're coming from with this?
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Dave. I appreciate the invite and the opportunity to discuss what I what I think is like super obviously relevant and important work on the part of Dylan Robinson. So as you noted, I think it's important as much as they're empty and kind of ubiquitous now, but seemingly um, uh, without certain discussion surrounding it. I think it is important in the terms of setting up our discussion today after reading Dylan's work and just the nature of the discussion that we do a quick acknowledgement, but with sort of a reflection of our own position here. So for me, I mean, I live and do my work in what is now considered London, Ontario. Um, it sits on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lene, Lenape, Walk people, and the Attawattaman peoples. Um, long-standing relationships with many different communities, including the Chippewa Nation of the Thames, the Oneida Nation, the Munsee Delaware Nation, right? And of course, there's a large urban indigenous population in the London area as well. That's important to recognize too. Long-standing relationships between the university as well and the communities across what we think of as southwestern Ontario now. And I think it's important, instead of just saying the words, to sort of set up what that means in relation to our discussion. Because as for myself, again, as a settler scholar, which means I have, for my own sake, I have Ukrainian and French background, coming to this land, which for different nations is thought of as North America, potentially Turtle Island, depending on your perspective. So for me, it's important to kind of reflect upon what that means as a settler scholar engaging with this work and doing it on the land of other peoples. And in this case, in London, Ontario, as I said, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape and Attawattaman. So that's sort of, I think, important to set the discussion because what Dylan Robinson gets into, a solo writer, a scholar, um, musician as well, living and working and writing in what's considered Kingston, Ontario now. I think he asks readers of whatever dissent who are engaging with his work to sort of set their position and think about how they're breaking down and engaging with what we're thinking through today is hungry listening.
But it's important to add as well for those that want to contribute in any ways to the ongoing Indigenous struggles, especially against the Canadian government and various other corporate interests that are trying to push through Indigenous land, trying to seal certain oil futures for Canada at the expense of Indigenous heritage, Indigenous land. There are many ways to contribute to those causes, and I'll leave links in the descriptions there. And if anyone else is more curious about what Ryan said as far as the specific nations upon which where we are now situated, in my YouTube info section is where I've placed my own like acknowledgement of these various nations, where you'll be able to see how they are spelt because it can be difficult for you if you wanted to look it up yourself. That could be a good place to start. And yeah, so when it comes to actually listening, what Dylan Robinson is on about is giving us not only, I'm using this as a kind of segue into his discussion, he's not only giving us a way to understand music, but as a way to understand or to think about how certainly people that are descendants of certain colonial regimes, how these people can develop a certain ear to listen to others. But he specifies, or he qualifies that it's not just listening for the sake of listening, but demands a certain reflection upon that listening, so that the type of listening we're fostering is not simply in the way of maybe appeasing white guilt or appropriating other voices. So as far as this term goes, Ryan, I know that there are many Indigenous terms that have been translated into what we call, and what Dylan Robinson calls, hungry listening. How would you give that history of that term as he kind of lays it out? Like, what do you think is important to mention about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think an interesting one, because it immediately gets to the heart, I think, of what Dylan Robinson's discussing. For one, it puts me in a position, sort of that uncomfortable position already, and the challenge to consider and reflect upon how I'm engaging with the material. And again, listening to the discussion and the writing and the composition and all of that. There are moments where I think it's helpful to break down the terminology, for sure, as Dylan does. But I also think I take a step back immediately and start to think, well, okay, the hungry listening that Dylan sets up is clearly from different, as you said, words in the Stolo language, which, in one sense, I feel I should be making an attempt at characterizing and speaking, but I also feel like I have no complete contextual background of the pronunciation of any of the different setups of the alphabets and all of that. So again, once I feel like I'm backing out of it, where I should be engaging the discomfort, but I'm sort of dancing around this because, on the one hand, I don't know if I'm here, I guess, to explain hungry listening, but more so to engage, and as you said, do that reflection and think about what it means to do that listening on our parts. Because in some ways, so I will attempt some discussion and explanation of it here, right? Because Dylan Robinson knows that hungry listening isn't a listening through whiteness by any means. So it's not just, we've come together today to discuss the problem of white listening or something. It's a characterization of listening through coloniality, right? So there is a marker of what he discusses as there are Asian American hungry listening structures, and there are experiences of Indigenous people under these hungry listening structures, and they're the same way that settlers of this and that descent, whatever it may be, engage in this hungry listening, because it's not reduced to a sort of racial identity by any means. So for us, I think today, in a weird way, it's where we're discussing like one small angle of hungry listening, which of course is narrowing it down, not just for the sake of avoiding other discussions, but for the sake of digging deeper into what that terminology and lived experience of hungry listening means for us. And I think to get into some of the more details of it, Dylan, notates or whatever that it comes from these terms referring to starving and settlers specifically, but starving person. So I think there are different ways we can take that, particularly whether it's a lack of knowledge, or as he clearly says and identifies a hunger to consume and just as you said already, appropriate knowledge. There are different lines and avenues that this hunger kind of refers to. And I think on the one hand, the lack is something that is necessary. It is there, for a reason, sort of inevitably, but it's something that can be turned into an obstacle that people feel they need to overcome, which I think Dylan addresses and says, it's not something that we're trying to overcome. It's something that needs to be, acknowledged and perhaps reflected upon and engaged beyond just something interesting that we see today, where it's reflect and move on or something like that. It's a bit more than that, but we can get into that later. And then the other hand, the starving element, I think, refers to this eagerness on the part of, I'll stick to settler, but it can refer to other non-indigenous, indigenous relations, of this eagerness, as we see today under this post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of era that we're in, where we really want to do the right thing sometimes, or we really want to, as you said, alleviate some guilt or exclaim that we're an ally or something like that. But I think part of that is a misstep that this hungry listening is naming. That as well intentioned as some of these things may be, we're moving a bit too quickly beyond some of the processes that might be more beneficial, and beneficial not in the sense of we're getting to an endpoint that we can check things off and pat our backs, but beneficial in the sense that we're actually doing some of the digging and engagement. But before I keep rambling, I'm kind of interested to hear what you felt or what your reaction was to when you saw sort of this starving identity of hungry listening.
Yeah, well, I guess there are a few things I would say about that, and that would be to add that from this book, which I have here, and I'll show anyone that would want to look it up and buy it. This is the cover. So if you're looking for it, this is what it looks like, and it's a great book. But toward the beginning, he makes a very interesting move, and just interesting from my perspective, not having seen that before, where he actually asks non-Indigenous readers to skip a whole section because it's not for them, in which, and I didn't read it. I don't actually know what he discusses there, but I assume it was a way to speak directly to his Indigenous community and those that identify among the Stolo people and otherwise. And so what that does, I think, certainly is demand that this project of allyship is one that demands people learning how to shut up, because there are many efforts on the part of colonial settlers to speak, and they speak too much, speaking on behalf of others, which, in order to immediately kind of challenge, demands listening. But like you said, Ryan, when we're discussing listening, it's not simply about colonial people listening to people who have been colonized, in this case, Indigenous people. It is quite multifaceted, and what Robinson gives us can really be a way to discuss how people listen across many different identities, many different nations, many different ethnicities. And so it demands that we really interrogate our own subject position and what our listening necessarily means, and the association with a certain hunger. And I remember him adding that historically the term, which I wouldn't be able to pronounce in any way, was also meant to refer not only to literally starving colonial people who would have died without the help of Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge, but these were people that were also starving for wealth during the gold rush. And so this image is not only of someone that is on the verge of dying, but someone that wants to consume endlessly, consume the land, exploit resources for their own benefit without actually reflecting on that thing, like the world being a thing that has its own kind of essence, that we are hurting violently with our uncritical consumption. And so I think that this reflects or relates to this notion of listening in that it demands a certain reflection upon listening, so that we aren't just committing this kind of hungry listening, trying to consume what certain like feminist scholars call the other, as being this site of interest. And there are many different other implications for that, especially when certain indigenous knowledges, certain indigenous cultural icons are used to proffer up a kind of Canadian national identity, like we saw in the 2010 Winter Olympics, right? Where suddenly Canada was all about demonstrating Indigenous heritage, which of course was just a mix and match of different ones that fit a certain kind of imaginary idea about what an Indigenous community looks like, what an Indigenous person looks like, which is of course totally detached from any kind of reality. And I would like to say on the side, Ryan, that I just read a book by Kyle Mays, who's do you know him? You know that, you know his stuff?
Yeah. I think Afro-Indigenous scholar. He did his dissertation in Michigan or Detroit. I think is that the one that's his?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he makes the interesting case, of course, that like Indigenous peoples have a very long history with not only with this kind of in how they are constructed in terms of living in certain places, but like there's a very prominent Indigenous urban population that is often like erased, and Indigenous connections as far as music goes to hip hop, to jazz, to blues, that is often erased. And how this entire history is something that is important to consider, not only when we're considering the history of music and how many of the different genres that we come to know and love have been kind of influenced by Indigenous culture in somewhat indirect ways, yet still very significant ways. It's important to acknowledge that. And when we begin to do that, we can see the kind of complexity of the project of listening and what it necessarily requires, without laying out a schematic as to how to properly do it, but points us in the right direction to motivating this kind of discussion, so that we're not just replicating a kind of hungry listening just to consume for the sake of consuming, and not respecting.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting about it lately for me is this kind of twist that we've seen now, where if there is a greater recognition, hopefully, that the world is finite resources and it's reaching a particular limit or threshold. Now we see the settler, state and construct and structures adapting it to be like, well, can we mine the histories of Indigenous knowledge now to save our way of life? And like you said, it's completely centered around the idea of consumption and extraction and all of that. But now it seems to be flipped at, well, we want to consume Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, all of that, to beef up and fix or repair our settler way of being and understanding, and that, so we can continue to consume, extract the land, bodies knowledge of Indigenous peoples. And for me, of course, that this I think for many Indigenous people is not new, not a surprise. Like, I think that's something that is unfortunately predictable, that again the settler state's going to continue to abuse, murder, culturally and physically commit genocide and all of that, try to continue to push its way of life through, which of course that's just astounding. But in terms of hungry listening, we see the attempts in inquiries, the commission itself, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I think on the one hand have some sort of benefit, depending on this revealing, or if there are certain people from certain nations that want to speak trauma and be heard on a national level. Of course, national, I'm already referencing that in settler terminology here, but there are certain elements of that that are helpful. But on the other hand, we're seeing this inclusion without reflection sort of practice that Dylan also gets into throughout the early part of the book. And of course, if I haven't mentioned already, Dylan is engaged with the discussion about what he rephrases as art music, which refers to on maybe a more settler side as classical music, or mostly classical music, I think, but sort of this European terminology and written structure of music and performance structure of music. And so he reframed it in sort of this indigenous plus art music, which again, it sounds weird and uncomfortable, but if as I say it, I can recognize that I'm already discussing it, but not really getting to the core of it, because there are things there that I cannot pull from, and it's not a cop out to say, well, I can't understand it, so I'm going to half engage with it and pull what I can get from it and move on. It's meant as sort of a recognition that there are things there that are refused, and like you said, with the section at the end of the intro, that is a refusal, a pushback to speak only to indigenous peoples, and refuse that this sort of desire and need to understand everything, or categorize everything, or consume everything, and dump it or move on or whatever it is. But the indigenous plus art music refrain is an acknowledgement of the poor approach to inclusion that we are seeing more frequently now, whether it's through Black Lives Matter movements, or as you said, protests against pipeline advancement and oil refineries and all of that. We're seeing an inclusion and a desire to be included on the part of settlers, and be involved in this and that, and be at the center of it. And on the other side, we're seeing inclusion in the sense of, well, if we include you and do these inquiries and commissions, or we include you in our identity as a multicultural nation for our world display for the Olympics or something like that, then we are on multiple levels, we're pretending to alleviate our guilt or responsibility, and also we're doing the work of inclusion, so we're getting better, right? But I think Dylan interrogates this quite well throughout the book. And again, I won't take or believe that I can unpack it all or take the time to do that. But his interrogation of inclusion, I think, starts and directs it towards the settler, and not the indigenous person who already, I think, as we've seen through other work like Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson, Audra Simpson, is that the inclusion is a falsity, but that the settler recognizing that the work of inclusion is not really the process being called for in the case of Dylan's work, or being as beneficial as we might think it is.
Yeah, and one of the ways that helped me to understand that was to draw a distinction between a pretty narrow distinction between form and content. And what I mean by that is that Dylan Robinson gives the example in the case of Indigenous music being incorporated into kind of the Western cultural imagination, however we want to position that as being the Canadian context or the United States context, or wherever, where the content of certain music is allowed, but it's often, of course, in doing that, it is decontextualized in that it is being divorced from the form, from the history, from its social linguistic setting. So you can play or have Indigenous music featured in where we often associate like classical music to be played in music halls or anything like that, without reflecting on the fact that we can't just take music, or music can't just be extracted from a setting and placed in another setting, and it will retain the same meaning. That would be totally, it's totally it doesn't really make much sense, or it seems like a pretty intractable thing to do. In that, to kind of vulgarly do it the opposite way, we probably wouldn't imagine seeing like an orchestra playing music in on a playground. Just the context matters, and it is just forgotten about when all we are doing is trying to proffer up a certain multicultural image that Canada tries to continually revitalize or to maintain. But in doing that, happening, of course, uncritically, avoiding actually engaging with these communities. And it is often just a kind of pressure valve to give Canada a pat on the back to say, oh, well, we've done this, so therefore we don't need to proceed with various hard investigations into missing and murdered Indigenous women, to lack of access to water on innumerable reservations, to disrespecting Indigenous heritage sites and culturally significant sites, which is all the more pernicious. It's perhaps not worse, but it definitely competes with just not doing anything, in that we provide ourselves the false illusion, or the illusion period, of doing something that is just superficial, is all it is.
Yeah, for sure. And so what I think is interesting too, I don't want to make it seem like I'm sitting here just throwing stones or whatever, because what I really found difficult, but exciting about Hungry Listening, the book, is like you said, the different ways that Dylan Robinson sort of refuses, content-wise and structurally, how different readers are going to engage with the book itself. And I think this comes across musically, as you said, where I love when he breaks down, of course, it's going to be in a opera hall or something when you see a symphony orchestra. Of course, you'll clap when the musicians are sitting, and of course you clap again when the conductor comes out. Of course, the instruments are going to be in tune, and if they're not in tune, that's a problem or something like that. That really, I'll admit to not having seen a ton of symphonies or orchestras. I've been in those venues, and I understand the sort of formality that gets attributed to them. But it also made me think about, standing in the club or the music hall or, the small bar or whatever, and thinking about sort of the structures and formalities, even of the dirty dive bar or whatever, that formulate and construct our listening experiences there. And regardless of who's playing, and oftentimes it's a settler band in the case of London, Ontario here. Excuse me. But that sort of push to reflect upon that, I found he doesn't even ask for it explicitly. He's not like, now go sit back and think about your last concert experience or something like that. It's sort of a challenge to the structure of the listening experience, in the formal sense, in the music that he is often engaged with, discussing, analyzing, contributing to. But it's a question and a push to move to think about what it means to listen, not just with the mind, or isolate the ear or the mind or something as the listening example of the body that you use or something like that. But it means, okay, what is the structure of the listening? What are the experiences that you're engaged with that seem perhaps secondhand or subconscious or unconscious or whatever it is? So I guess I was kind of curious as well. I don't mean to keep tossing questions at you, but did you have sort of a moment where you went to listen to music again after reading the book and necessarily was like, oh, more aware of it? Or did you kind of, was the listening more about the writing itself?
A little of both. I think for my own part, some of the biggest kind of cultural influences in that domain have been like A Tribe Called Red, and Buffy St. Marie, these indigenous musicians who I'm kind of very interested in, not only with their music but their political projects as well. And I one of the things, and this might be a little bit I don't know, giving myself up a little bit, but there was a tendency within me to look upon or to romanticize indigenous music in a way that I think is replicates the same kind of systemic form of oppression that I'm ostensibly trying to interrogate. And what I mean by that is that there's a tendency, or at least for me, there's a tendency to look upon that music as being just like naturally better or being more in tune with maybe a so-called truth of the world or the universe or something like that. And while I can't obviously say for sure whether or not that's the case, that is part in itself of this kind of cultural imagination in romanticizing this past to, what is now formulated as Canada, and it having this heritage that goes all the way back to these more pure forms. And in doing that, it not only kind of irons out the intricate differences between various different indigenous nations and how they conduct their music, how they conduct their listening, and just kind of romanticizing them as this like site of possibility, for the theoretical term or the theoretical kind of connection here, like the Deleuzian idea of just becoming, like you just pick something and there it's like a site of possibility, and then you can just become that. And that just kind of mirrors the logic of late capitalism like nothing else. Like, oh, that's something I can go and exploit. That's something that I can make myself better with, to make myself more in tune with what we've just kind of arbitrarily called like more natural or more real. And that is just a way to replicate these structures. And so in that way, I think that coming to terms with, because it's all too easy to say, oh, we just need to listen. As soon as you start to interrogate that very act of listening, to consider how that listening replicates the same system, then it comes down to really getting at the core of our own prejudices that we just don't see, that we just don't engage with. And that is, for me, I guess, the most significant thing that came up as a result of reading this text and really engaging with this idea. But I guess I would like to flip that script back on you and wonder how, two things. What did this do for you in the same way as you asked me? But how does this figure into your own work? How do you approach this idea, hungry listening, with your own, because you just recently finished your dissertation? How does it figure into there?
Yeah, I think uh, I'm glad you flipped it back to something, but because I think that's part of the discussion. It's again easy and good, but let's interrogate listening and reflect and reflect. I've probably said reflect 100 times already, but then it's like, where does it go from there? Because that's the hard part, and I think uh, that's the difficult part about whether it's the self-naming allyship, or how do we listen, or I'm gonna show up to uh, every protest and be the loudest person there, right? It's where do we move beyond that? And that is the next step that is unclear. And I think the difficult part that, rightfully so, Dylan Robinson hasn't. He's not. His next book isn't a thesis of how settlers are going to listen properly to, solo people or something like that. The work is meant and needs to be done on the part of non-indigenous people in whatever area, background, population you are, community member you are a part of. That work needs to be done on your time and on your part. So it's good. Again, another long-winded turn to get to the answer to your question, but I liked his point that perhaps a decolonial listening, or an unsettling listening, or whatever it is partially becoming not familiar or unfamiliar, or not even knowing what it means to listen anymore. And so that's a horrible paraphrase, but the sense of not understanding what listening means anymore is, I think, part of the process. And of course, it's not as like, oh, I don't know what I'm listening to, I don't understand it, so I must not know what listening is. That's two different things. Um, so for me, like personally, I think I as well have been interested and excited by the work of A Tribe Called Red and DJ Shub when he broke off and Bucky St. Louis. I was listening to "Come and Get Your Love" by Redbone again before this, kind of the classic rock element of it all. Um, Different electronic artists that are really sort of pushing different boundaries and mixing sounds and all of that. But and in the same way, I think you're right. I also have a tendency to romanticize and set up utopia in certain ideas, which is perhaps a fault, or it is a fault as you outline. But I think sort of the difficulty then of trying to, well, how do I listen differently? How do I listen better? What does it even mean? How do I listen to my own listening, or think about listening while I'm doing that? And it seems so abstract and far fetched, but it's all a bit of engaging with the understanding of your own positionality as forming your listening experience, from what I understand, right? So there are different contrasts of. I used to think more, even in the writing of my dissertation, that it's a sort of deep listening. That's what is beneficial, whether it's a deep listening on the side of Indigenous artists like Jeremy Dutcher or Maliseed in what we call New Brunswick now, and his listening to recorded versions of his people from years past, and reclaiming these songs. Right, and that's a deep listening. And a deep listening on the side of the settler then is really understanding what is um, not understandable, and what's being told to you in the performance and in the song. But I'm not so sure about that anymore. I think deep listening, as I think Dylan uh, asserts in later in the book, perhaps, is that deep listening might also be a bit of a misstep in um, trying to push deeper to understand what is happening in the music, in the song, um, in the European sense of notation or performance structure, as we mentioned earlier. But I think stepping back from that and turning the wheels again on yourself, which uh, feels weird and sort of perhaps Freudian or psychoanalytic or something like that. But I think it pushes against that as well. And I'm not trying to say it's the savior philosophy that pushes against everything or whatever, but I think encouraging a listener to sit within themselves, which I know is the hot topic these days. Get uncomfortable, and you don't understand what you can't understand, and all of that stuff. But I think you know trying to think about what that means as, again, I said that I have Ukrainian descent and French descent, not as a shout out, but as a understanding of um, the history of my experience on this land is, one, limited in my family history, but two, uh, based in different parts of the country, in Treaty One and in the London area, and in Treaty Three in Northern Ontario. But the reflection on that to me was recently this sort of settler precarity and the ability to jump around the land to find what's most lucrative financially or whatever it is for myself. But in terms of listening, it means thinking about, well, what is my relationship to the land, to the nations of the artists, and how is that informing what I'm hearing in the song? If Tribe Called Red is two members now from Six Nations, close to where we are in London, Ontario, but they do their work based out of Ottawa, Ontario. How does my relationship, as someone in London, Ontario, doing that work, influenced by what I'm hearing in the music and what I'm seeing in the videos. How does that relationship, reveal certain things to me, and how does it uh, close off certain things to me that um, immediately in my, pressing play on whatever or putting whatever material on to listen to, uh, it's immediately closing certain things off, but it's revealing certain things and it's forming how I'm listening to it. So I know that was long already, but to get to your second question, it kind of connects up here because I think what I took from most from Dylan's book, in terms of hungry listening, was uh, learning to shift the listening in the voice, in the lyrics, in the sounds of the voices, in the sounds of the instruments, in the sounds of the beats or whatever, be they computer generated or instrument. More to think about, well, what am I feeling? And I don't just mean, does it make me happy? Does it make me sad? But what is the sort of effective discussion going on there, which is something Dylan starts to push more throughout the rest of the book as well. That it's an encouragement to think about what are you hearing, and again, not just through the ear or through the mind, but what is the bodily experience, and what does that start to say about your connection to uh, place, people, community, position, all of those different elements. And it's been a struggle, right? I've written a bit and a few different articles about listening to certain pieces and artists, and other settlers listening to certain pieces and artists. And the most difficult part is, again, that reflection about what am I hearing, but I'm not just relating it in, it moves from a G chord to a D chord or something like that, right? Or it's an upbeat and it makes me, uh, you know, the endorphins or whatever and all of that stuff. It's more about, getting, for me, I guess my pull from it was the gut discussion. I realized that I tend to listen a lot through uh, my gut, and that's the weird sense of that's what I'm pulling. Well, this is making me feel unsettled, and why is that sense, and what is that feeling like for me, and where else have I felt that, and what does that mean in those moments? So it's more of, you know, turning to the body in the North American settler sense, but turning to uh, the connections that are coming from that interrogation of that sense. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, for sure. I made a ton of sense to me. Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else that we should mention about the term, or
Uh,
anything that you think would be important? Well, there's obviously a lot more, but
yeah, no. I was just looking. I made like one or two notes that were like, this is what should be touched on, but I think we got most of it. I think we hopefully did some justice to it and not walking the wrong way or something. But I don't know. Yeah, I think it feels good. I think the only direction left to go would be uh, again doing some sort of reactive listening or something. But I don't think that's necessary at all. You know.
what do you mean by reactive listening?
Well, like I think the call for like, well, let's think about how we specifically listen to a certain song or something, right? Because then that started the process later in, I think, Dylan's book, that he pulls in some settler scholars and he steps back in his own writing and says, okay, now you know do some work of reflecting on, and then they go into sort of the same process, right? It's a familiar process of, well, this is uncomfortable, but I understand it. This is sort of my background because this informs how I'm listening to things. I'm not sure where to go from here, and what's the next step, Dylan? Can you come back in? And so Dylan comes back in the writing and sort of pushes it a little bit. Um, but I think that's, from my sense as well, is the encouragement is a push to think about, you know, like not patting ourselves on the back again, but getting settlers or members of your community together to really think about what it means to listen. And part of that involves like doing some listening, and maybe we would do obviously not today. I mean, but we would do like sit down and listen to this song or this record and engage with what we're thinking about or what we're feeling and vocalizing that and thinking about how we're vocalizing it and experience it and how we're describing it. Because as Dylan said, part of the writing about how we're listening is that compositional part that might push us to different, listening practices, or at least reveal the practices that we're unconsciously perhaps engaged in. But maybe one day it involves listening to, as I said, a record or a performance or a concert, and maybe shifting the experience, not just um, solo on our iPods or whatever. Maybe it's a group setting, but maybe it's a group setting in a park or a group setting, whatever, just to shift that multiple experience. And over time, right, to think about, well, on our initial listen, this is what happened and what we thought about it and how we vocalized it and what we're think about that. And then 2 months later and months later, and sort of that, how are we really continuing to engage that listening experience and the making unfamiliar of the listening experience.
Yeah, that's great. That would be a really good exercise to do for others, like on here. The only problem with that are these greedy corporate copyright companies that are like, oh, you want to play music on YouTube? Have fun with that. But I mean, as far as the exercise go, I couldn't think of a better, as far as an engagement specifically with music, a better way to do that. However, I think that it demands, like, at least what Robinson is suggesting, demands not only the capacity to listen, but the capacity to convey what your embodied response is, like the effective dimension, which, and I would hate to generalize, but colonial descendants don't have. Speaking about our emotions is a very difficult thing, and people tend to refuse to engage with that part of themselves, which might be a product of just general maybe Western detachment from feeling generally in favor of rationalism, whatever kind of idea we can insert in there. And I wonder how that might be something that might come up as a barrier to realizing this reactive listening, or really promoting a fulfilling engagement with a piece of music, be it on a record or whatever. But it is certainly a wonderful image, and something that I think could be a good thing to work towards, and a good practice to help people be able to convey their feelings and to be able to match those feelings with a political project, in my mind at least.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you make a good point too, because it that's again where we can also get tripped up, and I find that too is I'm listening and reading, and I don't want to fall into, okay, well, how what does Leanne Simpson say about this, and oh, interesting, maybe I'll try that, and that's sort of the appropriate listening that again just falls back into the wrong pattern. But I think you're right that part of the struggle is, maybe that, or maybe the step of doing it hopefully alleviates some of that. Or maybe, again, encourages the fact that, well, listen, without just trying to do whatever that, name the chords or whatever. And again, that it's not that is bad in itself or horrible, but it also requires the reflection that, well, this is a colonial structure of understanding and listening to music. Yeah, I don't think I really added anything to your point there. I just am also in agreement that there is an interesting barrier there, and I'm not quite sure that I perhaps have an adequate response or
Yeah,
answer
I
to
don't.
that.
It's I don't know, just muddying the waters maybe.
Oh no, it's good. I don't think you were demanding one either. I was just reflecting on that, and I think that is, there hopefully will be barriers there, because if it's too easy, then maybe we're not really doing it. But then I think going through that is, I guess, the best way to combat. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. Thank you very much, Ryan, for helping me through that. And for anyone else that listened, I'll leave Ryan's contact information if anyone wants to reach out. That would be if they want.
Yeah.
Or, and then, yeah, if you made it this far, like, share, subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to leave a comment, any input you might have, or if we did anything wrong or approached this subject matter in a way that was unfair or in a way that wasn't properly reflective, if you're willing to put in that labor, that'd certainly be something we would love to hear and take those criticisms seriously. And yeah, on that note, thanks a lot for listening, and I'll catch you next time.